let's get this started. Really, this presentation today is how to become the manager that employees absolutely love. I'm joined here by Melissa Munier, our Marketing Director, also Jack Wiley, our Chief Scientific Officer, and I'm Head of Engage2Excel Group's People and Product. So again, welcome. We'll go over a few housekeeping issues, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Jack. So first off, we encourage you to use the Q&A function. It's always a great presentation and very engaging when folks ask questions, and I'm sure that several will be on your mind as we work through the presentation today. Also, if we can't get to your question, we'll be sure to follow up with you personally, so rest assured. Additionally, Melissa is going to record the session today, so we'll make sure that we get the recording out to everybody. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Jack. Dr. Jack is an author, a consultant, a researcher. He's been studying topics in employee engagement really for the last 30 years. He is the author of the book Respect. Many of you who are joining today as our clients are familiar with the Respect model and Dr. Jack's book on Respect. So, you know, very, very pleased that we have Dr. Jack to share with you some of his new research on what employees most want from their manager and really how to become a manager that employees love. Again, we want to thank our clients from Engage2Excel and Rideau and across EDE Group for joining us today. We know that it's a very difficult time right now when so many organizations really across the world are struggling amid the COVID crisis, and certainly hope you and your families are well. So Dr. Jack, let's kick it off, and of course, as we go along, if there are any questions, please use the Q&A function. So Dr. Jack, I will turn it over to you.
All right, very good, Jeff, and thank you very much. We, as Jeff indicated, appreciate very much your interest in this particular topic and what we have found about what employees most want from their manager. Of course, the starting point for this is pretty obvious, that the role that employees have with their manager is a critical one. That relationship is so fundamental and so impactful of a number of different things that happen within the context of their job and their career. And it occurred to me actually about a decade ago, that it would be highly valuable understanding the impact that that relationship has on so many different aspects of employment. It would be important to understand what employees most want from their immediate boss. And so I set off on a journey, much like the journey that produced the Respect taxonomy, to identify what it is that employees most want from their immediate manager. From technical terms, we might call this inductive research. We are simply trying to identify from the voice of the employee how they would characterize or describe the manager that they most want. And so that is the very first simple question. As we progress, Jeff, if you would animate next to that particular slide as we move through, that would be helpful. Go ahead and animate. We present this question: what is the most important thing you want from your manager? That was the starting point, and I'm going to be thrilled in just a moment to share the results with you of our global study. But before we do that, and in the spirit of getting your involvement right away, we wanted to ask you this question. We'll tally the results. Of course, the results will be confidential in the sense that your results are not going to be shared with anyone else. But let's take a look at this question and see how you would respond to this question. And in a moment, Jeff will share with us the poll results. Go ahead and take a moment to answer this question. Of the attributes listed below, what do you most want from your immediate manager?
All right.
So as those
results are.
They're still coming in. Yeah, they're
right.
still coming in, so we'll give them another 25 seconds or so.
While that's coming in,
right.
I suggest we go ahead, Jeff, and share our standardization sample and before we present the results. If we could move to the next slide. One of the things, of course, that is important in research is to think about where the data came from in terms of any conclusions that are being drawn. This is really the question of what we might refer to as external validity. To what extent can the results of any particular study be generalized more broadly? Well, in our case, this study was about as broad as you can make it. We included representative samples from 26 economies around the world. We made sure in our sampling process that we were tapping into all major job types. Certainly, we were inclusive in a proportionate way for all major generational groups and also all major industries. The 26 countries around the world that participated in this were countries that would largely match the G20, plus some additional countries in which we had some clientele, and it was important for us to have data from those countries as well. But the reality is, when it's all said and done, the results I'm going to share with you really document what employees most want from those countries that represent about 85% of the world's gross domestic product. Now, as I said, that's important because what it really means is that we can have confidence that these results are fundamentally universal. It wouldn't matter if you were an executive in the United States, or if you were a clerical employee in Germany, or whether you worked as a scientist in India. These results basically summarize the totality. We do recognize that there are going to be some differences by occupational group and generational group, but we're looking now and in today's session just at our overall results. And the conclusion we have, of course, is that they are fundamentally universal. All right, let's move on then. And Jeff, are you ready to share your results?
Yes, absolutely. Let's see what we have here. So again, of the attributes listed, what do you most want from your immediate manager? So it looks like from this group, we have really about a third, Jack, saying to show a support in consideration. We have the next highest at 26% being treating me with dignity and respect. And we've got a third to be honest and trustworthy. So, certainly pretty interesting. And Jack, how does this stack up with, your research from, from respect? Is this sort of what you would expect to see?
Right. I think the best way to answer that actually is to go to the results that we generated on the question of what employees most want from their immediate boss. So Jeff, you're in the driver's seat. If you would take us through this. We'll go ahead and animate all the responses in, and then we'll begin a summary process. Obviously, by virtue of how we presented that question to you, we were giving you a heads up of what our conclusions were. What we found was that really there was the most support in terms of response from employees for the category, the attribute of support and consideration. That was the one attribute that was wanted more so, or by a higher percentage of employees than any other. This was followed by recognition. Recognition, of course, being recognition for the contributions that I make. Then the remaining categories all hovered pretty equally between a low of 8% to a high of 12%. But you can see for yourself as we present on the screen that after the attribute of support and consideration, we have recognition followed by dignity and respect, about 1 out of every 10. Likewise for communicating clear performance expectations. Rewarding performance contributions came in at 8%. The skill of problem solving and decision making was 12%. And then the 2 values. Together, they added up to about 1 out of every 5 responses, but individually, we have 11% associated with being just and equitable, and 8% being aligned with being honest and trustworthy. If we go ahead and animate one more time, Jeff, we'll see how we are really separating these into behaviors, 1 skill, and 2 values. And so at the end of the day, we didn't start with any belief about what the results should be. We are depending entirely on the voice of the employee to identify this. And if we were to look at it from a psychological point of view, what's represented by the circles are really behaviors. I need my manager to be supportive and considerate. I need my manager to provide recognition. I need my manager to treat me with a sense of dignity and respect. I need my manager to provide clear performance expectations, and I need my manager to reward my performance contributions. And by the way, when we talk about rewarding performance contributions, we're talking about not only compensation, but also developmental opportunities. Then we come into the 1 skill. The way that people talked about this was problem solving and decision making, not simply that they engaged in that behavior, but they did it with skill. They did it effectively. They were more than just decision makers, but they made good decisions that had positive consequences for our team. And then finally, we have the 2 values, being just, that is treating all employees equitably and justly, and then finally being honest and trustworthy. So our participation group today touched on many of these, but we have a much broader spread among this global sample than we did in our polling numbers. But let's continue, Jeff, to the next slide. I wanted to share with you in their own terms how employees were describing these behaviors. These are direct quotes from employees that we had to content categorize and to place using very supportable statistical techniques into these categories with the confirmation process as well. But what employees were saying by support and consideration would be things like more support in daily activities. I would like them to listen to things. This was highly critical, this notion of the manager listening to employees and seeking out their input. Recognition is fairly straightforward, recognizes my good performance and gives recognition for it. Dignity and respect, some might argue, is very similar to support and consideration, but not in the voice of the employee. They want respect for who they are as individuals, for diverse working styles, and a sense of trust for what they bring to the organization, in this case, based on experience. Clear performance expectations, I think we can all identify with that easily. That's just making sure that all of our work objectives are clearly communicated, so when it comes time to understanding how we're going to be evaluated, that's already been spelled out. And then finally, rewarding performance contributions, that is both higher wages and personal development. So reward me not only in the sense of giving me higher wages, but also reward me by giving me developmental opportunities. If we can go to the next slide, we'll see how employees are describing this skill. I mentioned this already, so we don't need to camp here, but in the area of problem solving and decision making, it has to do with things that are beneficial, good decisions, in this case, removing obstacles, but the whole idea is making it easier to get my job done and to get it done effectively. And so let's move on to the values. The values are really things that are personal in terms of how managers show up and display their values on a day-to-day basis. With regard to just and equitable, as I mentioned already, this is equal treatment, fairness. They're not racial ethnic origin groups who are treated one way versus the rest of the employee base. There is not gender that is treated one way versus the rest of the employee base, but there's a sense of justice and equitableness throughout. Honest and trustworthy, well, we understand what that means, but people are looking for an alignment between what is said and what is done. Some leadership researchers would simply define this as integrity, that what people say and how they follow up is the same. They are indeed very effective at walking the talk. And so if we were to summarize on the next slide, we would see that we have a taxonomy that's emerging, a taxonomy that we would categorize as consisting of 5 behaviors, 1 skill, and 2 values. And so in a sense, there you have it. That's what it is that employees are saying that they most want from their manager. We could see this as an emerging model. And in fact, if we hit the animation, we'll see that for the time being, we're referring to this as the employee-centric manager. This makes it somewhat unique in leadership research because, again, we didn't start on the basis of anybody else's idea or any academic structure. We simply wanted the voice of the employee to tell us what it is they most wanted in their immediate manager. In fact, let's go to the next slide. And I wanted to share with you how this taxonomy compares to some others. Please don't be alarmed. There's not going to be an academic quiz or test on your recall of these things. But Gary Uckel, John Campbell, Professor Bartram, these are researchers that have put forward well-regarded academic models of what it is a leader does. And as you can see, hopefully on the screen, where there is a plus that indicates that there's a match between the employee-centric manager attributes and what we found or what has been found in other models of research. But very quickly, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. One behavior that isn't really covered in any depth in any of the other major academic models right now would be rewarding performance contributions. Uckel and Campbell simply touch on that. And perhaps more importantly and more obviously, the values of being just, the values of being trustworthy are not basically not mentioned at all, although Campbell does give some notation to this notion of personal values being displayed at work, and so we'll give partial credit for that. But in effect, the previous models that we have don't mention rewarding performance contributions, which is quite important to employees, and don't mention the personal values of justice and trustworthiness. So one of the questions that comes up, however, is if we understand that these are what employees want, how would we go about measuring that? What would be a system by which we could measure whether or not employees are being fulfilled in terms of their expectations, or we might call them preferences on the part of managers? If we go to our next slide, we'll start to lay that out for you. We actually have been measuring these attributes and continue to do this in our Trendicators research and other research in which we've been involved. These are what we would call items. They could be used in an employee survey to measure the extent to which employees believe their manager is operating in a way consistent with these preferences. We actually provided 2 such items for the attribute of support and consideration because it was twice as large as any other attribute in terms of the frequency with which it was mentioned. We would measure that by asking or stating my manager is supportive and understanding of my coworkers and me, and my manager is an effective listener. I won't read through all of those items for you. You can read for yourself, but they were presented on a 5-point Likert rating scale where people could strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree or strongly disagree. And this would be a way of providing an assessment of whether or not employees believed that their manager was stepping up and providing what they most preferred, what they most wanted in a manager. These particular items measure behavioral attributes. If we go to the next page, we'll see the same readout for the skill and for the values. So with one more click, Jeff, we should get one more item presented. There we go. And so we would measure problem solving and decision making with an item such as this. My manager displays competence in making day-to-day work decisions. The trustworthy item, as an example, is very straightforward. My manager is trustworthy. And again, people would respond to this on a 5-point Likert rating scale. Now, when we stop to look at the research academically, we know that actually employees are in a very good position to measure managerial performance. Many researchers would draw the conclusion that they are in the best position because they are the ones who have the most opportunity to observe the behavior of managers on a day-to-day basis. And when we look at the relationship between how subordinate employees evaluate their managers and how the supervisors or superiors of that manager evaluate their performance, we find strong positive correlations. And so in many respects, what an employee has to say about their immediate boss is very critical. Not only does it correlate positively and strongly with the superior's same evaluation of that subordinate manager, but it also is going to drive decisions for employees in terms of their sense of commitment to the organization, the extent to which they would advocate for the organization, and also, of course, their levels of engagement and therefore performance contribution. So that really begs the question then, how do ratings, if we can imagine producing a rating system on these 8 important attributes, how do the ratings of an employee-centric attribute measurement system relate to ratings of overall managerial effectiveness? And that brings us to our next slide, and really immediately after that, our next poll question. So the question really has to do with the relationship, and I'll let Jeff go ahead and present that for us.
Yeah, so this one, thanks, Jack. This one is kind of, what do you think? This is kind of a what do you think question. The strength of the relationship is between employee ratings of their manager on the combination of those 8 attributes that Jack just described, and then the ratings of overall effectiveness. So what is that relationship? And we're asking you what you think that relationship is. And just a reminder, folks, if you do have a question along the way, feel free to use the Q&A function. Jack, one thing that I wanted to ask you, your research seems very much a bottom-up approach, right, to really understanding the voice of the employee vis-a-vis what they want from their manager. Why do you think that this research has never been done before the way that you conducted it?
Right. Well, in science, we often build upon what has been done previously. And so if we look at many of the taxonomies that exist, it's one scientific step added to another scientific step. And in many respects, the behavioral leadership question goes back probably now 60 to 70 years with some of the original research that was conducted at the University of Michigan and the Ohio State University that basically said that there were 2 things that managers did. Leaders or supervisors, managers, whatever the name it is you give to that function, basically they engaged in consideration, which is very much like our consideration and support attribute, or they engaged in work facilitation or initiating structure to the performance of the work. But that in itself was based on prior research that was available. Here we started from ground zero. I had the opportunity and really the flexibility to approach this from the standpoint of doing something that had not been done before. And so instead of relying upon existing structures, we just said, look, let's go right to the voice of the employee. We have a mechanism that reaches out to 26 countries around the world. Let's collect these data. Let's do the translation. Let's look at how employees describe things in their own words and build a new taxonomy that is truly employee-centric. If we take the point of view that the most important asset of an organization is, in fact, its employee population, then from that, we would derive kind of the natural conclusion that as it relates to attracting employees, managing employees, retaining top talent, we would want to know what employees are looking for. And so that was the that was the genesis of this, unlike building upon someone else's work.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Jack. All right. So, Melissa, I think that we have our poll question results. And so it looks like, Jack, about 2/3 of folks say that relationship is a strong positive relationship or a moderate positive relationship at about another third or so.
Right. Very good. Well, let's move on and see what the results indicate. But I would just say at the outset, our group is well informed, as I think we'll see in the supporting research that is follows. Well, before we get into the question of what is the relationship, we need to think about how we're measuring that. So in our study, we were measuring overall managerial performance with 2 items. Overall, how effective is your immediate manager? And then the straightforward declarative statement, my manager is an outstanding leader. So it's the combination of those 2 items that really comprise the overall rating scale. So as we go to the next slide, then we're going to be summarizing what in fact it is that we found. Do attributes predict overall managerial effectiveness? They most certainly do. The answer overwhelmingly is yes, but the question becomes to what extent? And if we go ahead and add our animation here, we'll see that pretty clearly. In other words, what this is really saying is that with a measure on these 8 attributes, we can explain 2/3 of the ratings given to a manager's overall performance. This is based on regression analysis, statistical regression, but basically what it's saying is that we can be very confident in predicting what the overall performance rating would be for a manager if we know how his or her subordinate rates them on these particular 8 attributes. Now, for those of you who have a research background, you would probably agree with me that when you can explain 2/3 of the variance, so to speak, or account for 2/3 of an answer to a question based on other data, that gives you a lot to work with. To put this into an assessment or selection perspective, if on the basis of tests that we administer or interviews we could conduct, we could account for eventually 2/3 of an overall performance rating of an employee once they were hired, we would say that that testing system is incredibly successful. Well, basically what we're saying here is that how subordinates rate managers on these 8 attributes really explains or determines 2/3 of their overall rating. But that gives that, and our audience, I think, already understood that based on how they answered the poll question, so kudos to them. But let's actually ask a more difficult question. Now that we've established that, let's go to our next poll question that we might find just a little more challenging.
All right, thanks, Jack. So this next one, which attribute do you think has the strongest positive relationship to a manager's overall effectiveness? So of those 8 items, we're asking you to choose one. We'll give you guys just a second to do that. All right, how we doing, Melissa? How many responses do we have so far?
So far, we have 32. We'll give them a few more seconds to finish up.
All right. Okay, Jack, looks like the results are in. So
very good.
Interesting. So we have support and consideration being the number one at 46%, almost half. And then it looks like after that it's a real mix. We have honest and trustworthy and dignity and respect coming in as 2 and 3, but clear favorite here among the group with support and consideration.
Very good. Well, once again, I would say the group is pretty well plugged in. Let's see how the answers actually unfold in response to this question. The way we were looking at it is this: what is the most consequential way for a manager to improve his or her effectiveness? Well, what we found was, in conducting the regression analysis, was that first of all, it was support and consideration, but more specifically, the notion of being an effective listener. The most important way in which, or the most consequential way in which a manager can impact or influence positively how his or her performance is seen is by being a good listener. Secondly, it is skill in problem solving and decision making. And then thirdly, based on our most recent data collection effort, it is providing recognition or praise. And so instead of thinking about 8 attributes, although all 8 of them have an impact on how the subordinate would rate their manager, this is a relatively short list of what a manager could do to improve their perceived effectiveness in the eyes of their subordinate employees. Giving a listening ear, showing skill in decision making, and recognizing the performance contributions of employees. All right, so what we've covered so far is that we have a global study identifying the 8 attributes of what employees most want from their immediate boss. We call that a taxonomy. We've identified a way in which we can measure the effectiveness of managers on this, and we've shown that the attribute ratings are highly predictive of an overall rating, and in fact, the shorter list is to listen, make good decisions, and provide recognition or praise. If we go to the next slide, some may still be asking, well, SW squared C, what does this formula represent in social science research? It represents something very fundamental. It stands for so what and who cares. In other words, at this point, it's great that we have a taxonomy identified, that we have measurement people who can measure the extent to which these preferences are being fulfilled. It's not surprising that they're related to overall effectiveness, but how does this help us manage an organization? How does this help us actually create more value and higher levels of performance? So we would approach this from the standpoint of some questions that we would ask or challenges that we would like to solve. As we go to the next slide, we really position this as, how do we, for example, enhance the employee experience, move the needle on employee engagement, build more cooperative teams, and raise levels of team performance? So if we think about this in the context of a manager and his or her subordinate employees, that manager would be expected to have a significant influence on employee experience, on employee engagement, on the sense of esprit de corps that exists within the organization, and on actual team performance. So is there a relationship between these things? We believe there would be, and in fact, we're beginning to develop a theory that says, as we move to the next slide, that when we think about the employee-centric manager, we recognize the 8 attributes, we recognize a way of measuring overall managerial effectiveness, but we actually are predicting now that there would be a relationship between how the manager behaves, how the manager is evaluated, and these important outcomes. We've talked about employee engagement for probably close to 2 decades now. Within the last few years, we've increasingly talked about employee experience. A lot of work gets done, of course, by individuals, but also increasingly by teams. And so the relationships that exist within the team and their overall team performance is something that naturally we would expect the manager to influence. However, that brings us then to, I believe, another question that we are going to ask our well-experienced audience to respond to. Jeff, if you would.
All right. So this one here is around which employee or team outcome is best predicted by the employee-centric manager theory. So of these four things, employee experience, employee engagement, team relations, and team performance, what do you think it's best predicting? And Melissa will give folks 30 seconds or so to answer that. Just a reminder, folks, too, as we're progressing, if you do have any questions, don't be shy and use the Q&A function. All right, so here we have the results. It looks like about 2/3, Jack, are kind of leaning towards employee engagement, the overwhelming majority. We have, in second place, employee experience at 18%, and then team performance and team relations. So overwhelming majority say employee engagement.
Right, very good. Well, once again, let's take a look at what the actual results indicate. Employee preferred managerial attributes, overall managerial effectiveness. How does this influence the outcomes? Four are under consideration. And if we look at this from the standpoint of how much of the variance in these four outcomes we can explain, we see that there are some differences. But the reality is, based on the research that was just conducted earlier this year, what is best predicted is employee experience coming in at 72%. So in other words, how employees would rate their employee experience, 72% of that could be explained by simply knowing how they rate their manager on these 8 attributes and on overall effectiveness. Employee engagement at 61%. Team relations at 63%, and team performance at 50%. Let me step back from this and just say that, again, if we think about the amount that's being explained or accounted for by knowing how these attributes are rated and overall managerial effectiveness is rated, these are very high, strongly positive models of understanding these outcomes. How the manager shows up doesn't explain all of employee experience, but almost 3/4 of it. And as it relates to employee engagement and team relations, almost 3 out of every 5 elements of that, 3/5 of that can be explained. I'm not surprised that team performance is only explained at the 50% level, albeit that's still a very large percent of the variance explained, simply because there are so many other things that would go into team performance, including the technology that's used, the quality of the coworkers themselves, perhaps the competitive environment in which they operate. And so there are a number of variables that extend beyond perhaps the control of the immediate manager. But in fact, if we move back just for a second in terms of our thinking, what problems or what issues does knowing about this taxonomy help us to address? What challenges does it help us to solve? Well, what this really means is that if managers are showing up in a way that fulfills what employees most want in that managerial behavior, we're also explaining or accounting for or having a huge influence on all 4 of these outcomes. And so we can begin to project then that a system that measures managers on these attributes is a system that also could be used to predict employee experience, employee engagement, team relations, and team performance. All right, let's talk for just a moment about the properties of the employee-centric manager scale, but before we get to a couple of poll questions that we want to present to our audience. The properties of the scale of, yes?
Quick question. How are you defining employee experience here? That'd be great for folks to know.
Right. Right. So employee experience, very good. And of course, this is an emerging construct in many senses. People have been talking about employee experiences for the last few years, last handful of years. But if we look at what the literature says about employee experience, fundamentally it boils down to everything that has to do with the experience employees have in employment, perhaps even pre-employment, as well as post-employment with the organization. And it is seen as a means to the accomplishment of employee engagement. Most of the authors, the commentators on employee experience have talked about it as an analog to customer experience, which of course impacts customer decisions about purchase, about retention, about purchasing more and advocating. The same thing would be true from an employee experience point of view. Everything that touches the employee could have impact on important decisions about retention. Now, specifically, when we talk about employee experience, once again, we abandoned what might have already existed, and we've gone right to employees, and we've asked them in much the same research methodology that we've described here, what is the most important thing you want from the company for which you work? And the 7 responses to that form the acronym RESPECT, as Jeff already indicated. A book written with Brenda Kowski about 8 years ago was produced summarizing that research, but it basically said that employees want from their employer, from the organization, they want recognition, exciting work, security, fair pay, education and career growth, positive working conditions, especially as it relates to the absence of abusive supervision or an intolerance for inclusion and diversity, and then finally truth. And so those 7 elements are measured in the employee experience measure, which we can share with you the details of that as we move toward the end of the presentation. But that's how we're defining employee experience. Again, using the voice of the employee, not any kind of prefabricated way of measuring this, but relying simply upon how employees view these things.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack.
You're welcome. So properties of the employee-centric manager scale. If we're going to use a scale as a predictive device, as a measurement device, and all of the implications that can carry with it, we need to know that in fact it is standardized, it is reliable, and it is valid. We have a couple of poll questions for our audience. These might prove interesting. I believe the poll questions are really going to be answered specifically from the United States. We know that we have those from Canada in our audience. Please know that we're on the job and analyzing similar data from Canada, which we hope to be able to share with you later this year.
Great. Thanks, Jack. We have a couple of questions actually here. So, across all industries, what managerial attribute do you think employees rate the highest? So, of these 8, on a scale, which do you think gets the highest rating? And we'll give folks a few seconds to do that. All right, why don't we go ahead and show the results there? So it looks like support and consideration, Jack, almost 3 out of 4 say support and consideration, with dignity and respect being number 2, and then recognition. Interestingly, how we see almost a bit of a trend here from top to bottom, with the lower items receiving almost nothing.
Very good. I think we have a second question that we'd like to pose first and then provide you with some normative data, so to speak.
All right, great. This will be our last polling question, and we'll get that launched. And it looks like the next one is not showing up for some reason. Let's see, Melissa. There we go. Which managerial attribute do you think employees would rate as the lowest? The same question, just the inverse. What do you think would be rated the lowest? All right. Why don't we see those results? Just going to take a second to come in. And I think there's just a little bit of a delay. We're not seeing it yet, but it should be coming. There we go. So again, inverse, what is the lowest? And interestingly here, so you see just and equitable as number one, Jack, about a quarter. And then reward performance contributions, another quarter or so. And then, really kind of a distribution throughout the others. So just and equitable and reward performance contributions, those would be what people are saying here on this call is the lowest.
Very, very good. Well, let's see how that compares. We'll do a little bit of homework before we get to that, but if we can go to the next slide, and let's go ahead and build the whole slide out. For those of you who might have a measurement background or statistical background, this simply has to do with how the attributes correlate to the total item scale score. And we have some animation that can come in here, Jeff, if we do a click or two. What this really means is that the individual attributes that most correlate to the overall total scale score are support and consideration, just and equitable, and honest and trustworthy. And we also see how that relates to managerial effectiveness. If we pointed out before, the issue of what might managers do to most impact, and the right-hand column, the higher the correlation coefficient, the stronger the relationship. But we see that there are three attributes, support and consideration, also problem-solving and decision-making, and being honest and trustworthy, that are the most highly correlated to managerial effectiveness. Now, that's just by way of background, telling us once again that we have strong relationships between the attributes and the total scale, the attributes and the overall rating of managerial effectiveness. Now, let's get to the answer of the question of the top and bottom rated attributes at the present time as it relates to the United States as one population that we serve. If we go to the next slide, we can think of this almost as a training needs analysis. We'll first look at all industries and then at best practices organizations. But what we have color-coded would indicate that the highest score, interestingly enough, does not go to support and consideration, but on a 5-point Likert rating scale, with 5 being the highest score, we have a little bit of a mean score above the rating of 4.09 for dignity and respect. This is what achieved the highest rating. What achieved the lowest rating was rewarding performance contributions, and I think that was predicted by our audience. But after dignity and respect, we actually have managers being honest, just, being good problem solvers, and providing clear performance expectations, all ranked or rated, I should say, above support and consideration. Interestingly enough, what managers are perceived as doing least well, if you will, is doing a good job of rewarding performance contributions through ensuring that employees are properly paid and that they have developmental opportunities. I call this a training needs analysis because, in a sense, if the goal was to make these scores as high as possible, then the single attribute that most needs improvement is rewarding performance contributions. We see actually the same profile in our best practice organizations. We won't take time to fully develop what that is, other than to say that this is the cream of the crop. The scores are naturally notably higher, but what is the highest and the lowest remain the same. Jeff, let's go to our next slide as we begin to summarize. So based on the taxonomy that we have presented, again, existing entirely on the basis of what employees said they most want, we can begin to see how understanding these preferences could actually lead to the construction of assessment and selection methodologies. Already, we've demonstrated how it could be an upward performance feedback tool and an organization-wide training needs analysis. Imagine having this kind of metric across all of the managers within your organization, perhaps segmented by department or division or level of management. Certainly, a management development program could be developed on the basis of this taxonomy, which of course could contribute as well to decisions about who should be promoted based on their performance on these attributes, as well as exit decisions who may not have what is needed to be able to work with employees in a way that would produce those important outcomes of a positive employee experience, increasing employee engagement, acceptable team relations, and of course, improving team performance as well. That is fundamentally what we wanted to share. I think we are at the bewitching hour, but we'd be happy to entertain for those who would like to stay with us on for any questions and answers that might come up. You provide the questions and we'll do our best to provide a reasonable response. Do we have any that we would like to pose? Of course, we've been answering a lot of questions or asking a lot of questions and responding to your answers as we have proceeded with the polling questions, but let's open it up to see if there are other questions that people would like to present.
Great, thanks, Jack. And yeah, apologies for the late start, guys. We're running out of time, but we did get a comment from Heather. I think it's an interesting one, Jack. She mentioned that she found it interesting that we mostly get support and consideration. However, just and equitable and honest and trustworthy really negates all that trust and consideration that they give. So it was more of a comment from her about, I think the importance of the interplay with some of these items.
Right, right. I do think that's a good observation. Values, the values that we carry with us are going to influence our behavior. Psychologically, we would understand the difference between behavior, values, and skill, but values are going to be the bedrock that give rise to how we interact with others. And we play out that paradigm that exists within our own mind about what our responsibilities are to others and how we should behave toward them. So I do think there's a strong degree of interrelationship between the values of fairness, the values of trustworthiness, and how that shows up in the support and consideration we provide to others, and in this case, most especially our subordinate employees. I think it's a great observation.
Great, thanks, Jack. Also, we have a question from Edith. How do these traits in managers correlate to team performance? Right.
Actually, they correlate very strongly. One of the things that we measure in team performance has to do with the productivity of the team, the quality of their product or service, whether it meets its goals on time, and an overall sense of how effective the team is. As we said before, these attributes and the overall rating of managers are highly predictive of team performance, but it doesn't predict everything there is to know about team performance. We can only account for about 50% of the variance in team performance knowing these things. So it does imply clearly that there are other things outside the control, perhaps of the manager, or outside these 8 attributes, at least, we should say more specifically, that have an impact on team performance. Some of the things we suggested could be actually the quality of the talent within the team, the technology they have to use to get their work done, the resources that might be available to them. Let's say, for example, if we're going to measure quality, what is the emphasis organization-wide on continuous improvement in quality or customer orientation? There may be a value system up the chain of command that says that we're not going to spend all of our resources achieving higher levels of customer satisfaction. We'll be satisfied with moderate levels of customer satisfaction. These have to do with policies and organizational values that are probably beyond the impact or influence of the immediate manager, unless they reside at the very top of the organization.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack. We got time for one more question here. I realize we're running out of time, but we've still got quite a bit of folks who are still with us, so we thank you for that. What is your take, Jack, on servant leadership approach compared to what we've reviewed today, and how would you align them, if at all?
Right. Well, I think that actually ties back very nicely to Heather's question as well. If you think about the servant leadership theory, it would draw heavily upon what it is that we see as the major attribute, the one identified most frequently by employees, and that is support and consideration for others, and then also the values of being honest and the values of being just and fair, just and equitable. Those 3 attributes together would come the closest to defining what a servant leader is all about, perhaps in addition to the idea of treating people with a sense of dignity and respect. If we tie servant leadership back more or less to its origins, it has almost a religious element to it. The point of view that we should treat others as we ourselves would like to be treated, or that one of our most important responsibilities in life is to treat others with respect and to show them a high level of regard and concern. And so I think those 3 to 4 attributes align or overlay almost perfectly with the servant leader concept. What this, however, provides is something a little more broad than that, because it also identified other attributes that aren't as directly aligned with servant leadership. But I would say that support and consideration, dignity and respect, the values of honesty and trustworthiness combined with justice all go a long way to overlapping very well, perhaps almost completely, with the servant leadership theory.
Great. Well, thank you, Jack. And that was really an enlightening session. And we just want to thank everybody. Thank you, Dr. Jack, for sharing your thoughts on this very interesting research. And we thank our clients who joined us today. If you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to us. We thank you. Have a great day, and stay safe and healthy.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.